week for the fantasy football season, and his running backs sits every matchup this week. Thursday night, Dallas Cowboys at the New York Giants. Dallas Cowboys, Giants, over the last 5-6 years, Cowboys have won this series. And now this one Thursday night at MetLife Stadium. Rico Dotto, he's a flex option for me. He looks like the back tone here for this Dallas Cowboy team. I know week one, Zeke had the majority of the touches for the Dallas Cowboys, beating out Dotto. But the last 2 weeks, Dotto's had the touches, and he's catching the football out of the backfield as well. That's something that Zeke doesn't really do. So Rico Dotto in a decent matchup versus middle of the pack to poor defense of the New York Giants. I think he could go out there and have some decent numbers as Rico Dotto is a flex option. So far this season, 8 or more fantasy points. He scored in each game in PPR leagues as Dotto. So this week with a decent matchup and a game that should be close for majority of it. He's a flex. Zeke is a sit. We haven't seen much from Zeke this season. Like I said, his best days are behind him, and the Cowboys pretty much brought him in as a short yardage guy at times and a depth piece on the roster where they didn't make any moves at the running back position, only losing Tony Pollard in free agency. So even with a decent matchup, I couldn't trust Zeke Elliott, especially where there's still no bye weeks. Devin Singletary, I would give it a start. I think Singletary's a solid number 2 running back for fantasy owners. The volume is there. Tracy's not really a threat to the workload. In the last 2 weeks, he's had double-digit fantasy points. Is Singletary in PPR leagues, including in week 3 with a big ball game for Devin Singletary at the Cleveland Browns, who we know is a pretty solid defense. So this week, I would put him in the lineup. Next game, Cincinnati Bengals at the Carolina Panthers. Zach Moss, I'd give the start to win this ball game. Zach Moss, he had a solid week 3 ball game. I know some of it was garbage time, but he still out-touched Chase Brown in that game. Had 19 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And Zach Moss, the number 1 running back for the Cincinnati Bengal team, with Chase Brown's more in there on passing downs, even though he had a nice game in week 3, 7 carries, 62 yards. Zach Moore still getting majority of the touches and also could catch the football out of the backfield as well. So this week in a plus matchup at the Panthers, he's a start. Chase Brown's a sit for me. The first 2 weeks, we didn't see much out of Chase Brown. Then he had a good game yards per carry wise, almost 9 yards per carry for Chase Brown in the week 3 loss versus the Washington Commanders. But besides those big carries and a few catches out of the backfield, still the snaps weren't more than Zach Moss. He got about 40% of the touches in that ball game was Chase Brown. And like I said, Zach Moss hits his backfield. And I think this Cincinnati Bengal team, they're going to start throwing the football a little bit more as well. Now to the Panthers, flex is Chuba Hubbard. I know he's coming off that game over 100 yards on the ground, finding the end zone, and 5 catches, 55 yards versus Vegas Raiders. But this week, I think it's going to be a tougher game for the Carolina Panthers to run the football. Obviously, they're versing a way better offense where the Bengals could put points on the board early and often. Chuba Hubbard's not going to get over 20 carries in this game. And also as well, this Cincinnati Bengal team, they've been solid versus the run for the most part. So at best, I think Chuba Hubbard, even coming off that big performance, is a flex option this week. New Orleans Saints at the Atlanta Falcons. Alvin Kamara, he's been a top back so far in the early going. Even in a down game versus the Philadelphia Eagles in week 3, he had double-digit fantasy points. He's the workhorse over there. Jamal Williams, he's not a threat. Taysom Hill's banged up, wasn't a threat as well. And Kamara, you fire him up every week. Same with Bijan Robinson. He's matchup-proof. Top 3, top 4 running back at worst case is Bijan Robinson. Had a pretty tough matchup versus the Chiefs. Still went out there, had a pretty decent performance. He's a start. Tyler Algier is a sit. Tyler Algier, if he was a starter for another team, I believe he'd be a top 15, top 20 running back weekly for fantasy owners. But with Bijan Robinson there, like I mentioned, he just doesn't carve out much of a role, Algier, to have every week appeal. So this week, he's an easy sit versus a pretty solid Saints defense. Next game, Jacksonville Jaguars at the Houston Texans. Travis Etienne, he's a start for me in this one. Week 3, that's just a game you forget about and you don't really go off the stats because Etienne, he's been a bell cow this season, last season as well for this Jacksonville Jaguar team. He's going to get a lot of work, and pretty much he's their best offensive player this season for a bad 0-3 Jacksonville Jaguar team. So this week in the matchup at the Houston Texans, that just got shredded on the ground from Aaron Jones. Etienne, I would give the start, and even if they're trailing early and often, we know he's a good receiving back out of the backfield as well. Tank Bigsby, a sit. Week 1, we know he got 12 carries. Week 2, he got hurt early in that game, left versus the Browns. He didn't play. And then this week, in week 3, at the Buffalo Bills, only 2 carries, so he was a non-factor. He's a sit. to the Texans. Joe Mixon, if he returns off the ankle injury, he's a start. Joe Mixon was on a tear the first 2 games of the season before he got hurt with the ankle injury. So if Mixon's back in the lineup versus this weak run defense, he's a start. And Cam Akers, if Mixon is out of this game, is a flex option. Akers, he had 9.90 fantasy points, found the end zone in last week's game. But it was a game where they got blown out and were down early and often was this Houston Texan team at the Minnesota Vikings. So right now, I think Cam Akers is a decent flex option versus a weak run defense that just gave up a lot of yards and a good ball game to James Cook. He would be a flex option this week. Denver Broncos at the New York Jets. Broncos, it looks like they were going with 3 running backs in last week's game and the surprising 26-7 victory at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Denver, they got Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, and then the youngster Tyler Beatty worked in and outtouched both those running backs. I know some of it was garbage time, but they liked what they saw from Beatty, and he actually had about 8 yards per carry in that ball game at the Tampa Bay Bucs. But we got to see more out of Beatty to have fantasy value. Like I said, McLaughlin hasn't really done much this season. I know he got a touchdown in last week's ball game, but besides that, non-existent numbers. And the same for Javonte Williams. He hasn't been totally horrible, but he's not really a running back you could count on week in and week out, and especially in a tough matchup versus New York Jet defense that just shut down Ramondre Stevenson, who got off to a hot start. They will sit Breece Hall. He was a top 2, top 3 running back at worst. Drafted in fantasy drafts. He's a must-start. He's matchup-proof. He's catching the football out of the backfield. I know his yards per carry aren't all that great, but in terms of putting up fantasy points, at minimum, he's 15-plus a week. Braylon Allen, I think as the weeks go on, if he could get a consistent 8 to 12 touch workload, he could be a flex option, especially in bye weeks. But with bye weeks starting in week 5, and Braylon Allen, I have to see a little bit more work from him. He's a sit, but he's definitely someone that should be rostered in all 10 and 12-team leagues is Allen. Minnesota Vikings at the Green Bay Packers with a nice division matchup early in the season here, with Minnesota 3-0 on the year traveling to Green Bay. And this Minnesota Viking team, they've been playing great football. Sam Darnold, he's come in and he's looked like a player that the New York Jets thought they were going to have when they drafted him early in the first round many seasons ago. And he's come into his own with this offense. 4 touchdowns in last week's game. And Aaron Jones has been a big factor on the ground with a monster ball game in week 3. I think Aaron Jones, though, he's playing a little bit over his head. And we always know there's an injury coming up, but this week versus former team, you know he's going to want to stick it to them after they replaced him with Josh Jacobs. Aaron Jones a start this week. Ty Chandler is here. Ty Chandler is still one of the better handcuff running backs in the league, but the workload just isn't consistent enough for both these running backs to have value. So if anything ever happened to Jones injury-wise, I believe Ty Chandler could step in and be a top 24 option weekly. Josh Jacobs a start in this one, but we did see Emmanuel Wilson, who's listed on here, get 13 touches in that game. I know some of it was garbage time, but we know Matt LaFleur, he always likes to have a committee and not really run his running backs into the ground, even though Jacobs, he did have 32 carries in week 2's ball game versus the Indianapolis Colts. But I believe Josh Jacobs, he's a solid start. The workload's going to be there. Now with Jordan Love back in the offense, the boxes won't be as loaded as well. Now to Emmanuel Wilson, he's a sit, but definitely someone that should be rostered in 12-team leagues or deeper. Like I said, he got 13 touches. Garbage time or not, he went out there and produced, including a 30-yard screen that he took to the end zone was Emmanuel Wilson. So right now, he's out there in tons of fantasy leagues. I mentioned him on the waiver wire video. And this week, he's a sit. Pittsburgh Steelers at the Indianapolis Colts. Najee Harris after the ball game in last week's victory for this Pittsburgh Steelers team versus the Chargers. He was in a sling, and we'll see if he's going to play in this game. Even if he does, it's a tougher matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts, where I believe their run defense. Well, last week I thought their run defense played a good role versus the Bears' run game, even though this Bear run game hasn't done much all season and the O-line ain't great. But Najee Harris, even last week, first half he didn't do nothing, and second half he salvaged his day. But now with the arm injury and in a sling, I don't know if he's going to play, but I'm going to list him on this start sit this week. Jalen Warren a sit. He's banged up as well with a knee injury, and we got to wait the results of the MRI. And even if he's healthy and ready to go, which it doesn't seem likely for Jalen Warren, he's a sit. He hasn't done much in the early going. And Najee Harris, feeding Najee Harris a lot. He's getting a lot of carries weekly for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. And Jalen Warren's nothing more than a change of pace and at times a passing downs back. So he's a sit, plays or not. And Cordell Patterson, if both these players are out, he could step in to a starting role. He's the veteran running back Patterson, and obviously former wide receiver, but he will be a sit versus the Indianapolis Colts. I think Justin Fields, then at that point, he'll start running the football more out of the pocket for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. If they're down Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, even though Cordell Patterson, he did have some juice left, it looked like, in the end of that ball game last week versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Still someone you should roster in your fantasy leagues if Harris and Warren are hurt, but not someone I would start this week. Jonathan Taylor, he was a top 5 back drafted in fantasy drafts. He's off to a great start. I know it's a tougher matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, but he's a running back you put in your lineup each and every week. Los Angeles Rams at the Chicago Bears. Kyren Williams, even versus a tough defense and without the top 2 wide receivers, went out there and had a monster performance, finding the end zone 3 times. And at this point, he's a matchup-proof running back as well. This week, it's not the greatest of matchups at the Chicago Bears, but Kyren Williams is someone that's an automatic start. Now to the Bears, it's a committee back there in the backfield with Swift, Roschon Johnson, and Khalil Herbert. And to be honest, none of these players are really producing. I know it's a pretty decent matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams, but now we're 4 weeks in, and if some players aren't producing, I think it's time to move on, or just stash them on your bench and hope you find other players on the waiver wire, or these guys pan out eventually. But DeAndre Swift, he hasn't looked good in the first 3 games. Khalil Herbert, he's had some opportunity, but he really hasn't done much. And the same with Roschon Johnson. But like I said, none of these players are putting up enough numbers and enough touches. Be starters right now, Philadelphia Eagles at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Saquon Barkley, coming into the year, I said he was going to have a big year with this Philadelphia Eagle team. The best offense he's played with, even though they're down A.J. Brown and now possibly Devonta Smith, they might be down as well, where he's in concussion protocol. But Barkley, he's a must-start no matter the matchup. He's been on a tear to begin the season, and this week a pretty good matchup at Tampa Bay. Rachaad White, Bucky Irvin, both sits for me. Rachaad White, coming into the year, there were rumblings that Bucky Irvin, they drafted him for a reason. Bucky Irvin was going to get work, and now Todd Bowles has come out and said Bucky Irvin, he's definitely deserved more touches, and that's what's going to happen moving forward. So Rachaad White, if he's not catching the football out of the backfield, he's not really doing much. And now with the snaps reduced and a tougher matchup versus the Eagles, he's a sit. And Bucky Irvin, definitely someone that should be rostered in all 10 and 12 team leagues, but he's a sit for me as well. We got to see what type of workload he gets, with Todd Bowles saying he's going to get more work. Usually his touches are anywhere from 7 to 10 touches per week for this Tampa Bay Buck team. But if, let's say, he goes out there and he's getting a guaranteed 12, 15 touches, then he's someone I'd be more comfortable with in my lineup. But we got to see what his workload is going to be. So he's a sit this week. New England Patriots at the San Francisco 49ers. Stevenson, he had 2 nice weeks to start off the season with 15-plus fantasy points in PPR. But this week, he's a flex option at best. It's a tough matchup at the San Francisco 49ers, even though I know Kyren Williams ran all over them and made big plays in the Week 3 upset victory versus the Niners. But like I said, Niners are better at home. This offense is nowhere near the offense, even with the injuries of the Los Angeles Rams. And I think Stevenson's a back-end 2 running back to flex option. Antonio Gibson's a sit. Week 2, he had a nice ball game. Antonio Gibson versus Seattle Seahawks. But last week, he didn't really get much going at the New York Jets. And this week, it could be a similar type of game script where they're down early and often. And I know Gibson's a decent receiver out of the backfield. But this New England Patriot offense, once again, for the most part, it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of avenues for these players to be successful week in and week out. Season 6. Jordan Mason, the first 2 weeks of the season, had monster performances. Last week, he came back down to earth again, but he's getting a big workload, especially with Deebo Samuel banged up. He's not taking some touches away in the backfield. And Jordan Mason, he's a 3-down cowbell for this San Francisco 49er team. And the way this ball game should go, he's going to get a lot of touches once again, and he's locked in as a must-start weekly. Next game, Washington Commanders at the Arizona Cardinals. Brian Robinson Jr. is starting this one. It seems like weekly he's finding the end zone. And now with Austin Eckler, I believe, most likely out. That's why I didn't list him on this video with a concussion, leaving in the Week 3 victory at the Cincinnati Bengals. Robinson's going to be in for a little bit more of a workload. And like I said, every week he's finding the end zone is Robinson. And he could also catch the football out of the backfield as well. So this Washington Commander offense is starting to get things going after putting up 38 points in the victory in Week 3. And Robinson in Week 4, I like the matchup at Arizona. He's a start after we saw David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs dominate last week. James Conner started. I know last week wasn't a great game for Conner, but he's the bell cow over there. Trey Benson not really getting any work in the backfield for this Arizona Cardinal team. And I believe this could be a close game, or it could even go the other way, where Arizona gets off to an early start, even though this Commander offense is definitely improving over the last couple weeks here. But James Conner, he's going to get his carries. We know he's a decent pass catcher out of the backfield. He's a start. Trey Benson is not getting enough work, but a decent backup and a handcuff for fantasy owners, but not someone I would put obviously in the flex or in my starting lineup this week. Kansas City Chiefs at the Los Angeles Chargers. Carson Steele, a start for me. I like the workload for Carson Steele. 18 touches and played 62% of the snaps in the Week 3 victory at the Atlanta Falcons. The only thing with Steele, he doesn't have receiving upside, really. Only one catch for 2 yards in that game where Samaje Perine was coming in on passing downs. But this is going to be another game, I believe, where Kansas City's going to be up or it's going to be close. Steele's going to get his 15, 18 touches in this one. And if he could find Pater, it could be a huge ball game for Carson Steele. So I like the way he ran. He got a majority of the touches. And the way this game script should go as well, I think Carson Steele will get work. And he's a running back I would start this week. Samaje Perine is sit. The game script might not go Perine's way in this one, where he had 9 touches in the Week 3 victory at the Atlanta Falcons, 6 carries and 3 catches out of the backfield. So Perine, he's definitely a solid veteran wide receiver, but in terms of being an option for fantasy football, I just haven't seen it yet. So this week he's a sit. Los Angeles Chargers, J.K. Dobbins, first 2 games of the year, over 130 yards on the ground in both games. And then last week came back down to earth in a tough matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. But Dobbins is a back-end number 2 running back option in a tough matchup versus the Chiefs. I'm still going to put him in the starting lineup. He's an explosive running back. This could be a ball game where Justin Herbert's out and they're just going to try to force feed Dobbins, even on dump offs and running the football, where either Taylor Heineke or Easton Stick in there quarterback, depending who they're going to go with, is this Los Angeles Charger team. So even in the tough matchup on volume alone, I like Dobbins. Gus Edwards is a sit in this one. Gus Edwards, if they're going to be trailing in this one, he's not going to get a lot of work. He's not catching the football out of the backfield. Last week we saw Edwards barely had any impact at the Pittsburgh Steelers. And with Dobbins off to a monster start to begin the season, they're taking the touches away from Edwards, and Dobbins is the guy right now in that backfield. Next game, Cleveland Browns at the Vegas Raiders. Jerome Ford, he's a flex option for me this week. Jerome Ford, he had 70 yards total last week. I know this Brown offense, it's been horrible this season, besides last week where Amari Cooper finally went off in that ball game versus the New York Giants. But Jerome Ford as a back-end 2 running back flex option, which I got to mark as a flex. I think he can have a decent ball game at the Vegas Raiders. We just saw last week Chuba Hubbard go out there, rush over 115 yards in that ball game, had 27 fantasy points in PPR leagues. I think Jerome Ford could carve out a role and be a decent option this week. Devonta Foreman, the only way he's going to be really fantasy relevant if it's a close game or they're leading and he's trying to run down the clock in between the tackles. But 2 weeks ago, he had 15 touches, was Devonta Foreman at the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then last week, he was non-existent versus the New York Giants. So he's a sit. Vegas Raiders running backs, there's not much to say. Zamir White, Alexander Madison, to me, it doesn't matter who gets the touches. This is a tougher matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. And none of these running backs are doing anything. I know Madison, he showed some flashes catching the football out of the backfield, but I don't think it's enough to garner even being a flex option unless you're in the deepest of leagues or dealing with a lot of injuries. So both these running backs are easy sits for me this week. Sunday Night Football, Buffalo Bills at the Baltimore Ravens. James Cook, he's a locked-in starter, top 10 option each and every week, coming off another nice performance, finding the end zone, 18.80 fantasy points and 4 catches, 48 yards as well in that game. And this week in a matchup with Baltimore, where their defense hasn't been all that great this season, Cook has another good game. Derrick Henry a start each and every week, even though I think Henry last week was a monster game for him, over 150 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. I don't think he's going to match that again this season. It was a big game for Derrick Henry. And this Buffalo Bill defense, they're playing great D of late. So I think Henry, his numbers are going to drop off a little bit over the next few weeks, where I think the declines are going to come sooner than later. Start running back each and every week right now, with the position being weak, with a lot of injuries. And so far, he has produced. The first couple weeks, Justice Hill, nothing more than the third down, change of pace back at times for this Baltimore Raven team. And in a ball game, maybe where the script is, they're going to have to throw the football a lot. If Buffalo gets off to an early lead, Justice Hill's still not a running back I'm going to have confidence in to be consistent week in and week out. And he's a sit this week. First of two Monday Night Football games. Tennessee Titans at the Miami Dolphins. Tony Pollard, he's a flex option this week. I know the Dolphins defense isn't all that great. We just saw Zach Charbonnet come out and have a nice performance for the Seattle Seahawks team. And Tony Pollard, though, he's in an offense where defenses, they're going to game plan now, I believe, to stop the run. Will Levis try to throw the football down the field and make plays. And we saw that in Week 3 where Green Bay went into Tennessee, and that was the game plan. Stop Pollard early, get off to a lead, and then start teeing off on Will Levis, and he'll turn the football over, and that's exactly what happened. So I think this week, that's what Miami has to bank on. I know their offense isn't going to be good at all with either Skylar Thompson or Tim Boyle at the quarterback position the next few weeks minimum. But this week, Tony Pollard, in a decent matchup, he's a flex option. Tajay Spears is a sit. The first 2 weeks, he didn't do much. Last week, I know he's better out of the backfield catching the football. And that was just the way the game script was going, and a lot of prevent towards the end of the game. The Green Bay Packers were playing where those little dump-offs in middle of the field, 10 and turn routes were open for Spears. But this week, he's a sit. Miami Dolphins, Devon Achane, you start him each and every week for this Miami Dolphin team. He's an explosive running back. I know last week he didn't do much on the ground or through the air, but they were down early and often, and Tim Boyle and Thompson just couldn't move the football. But this week, I think Miami, they're going to come out with a little bit of a different game plan. They're back home, and they know they got to find ways to get their playmakers the football. And Devon Achane and Tyreek Hill. So this week, he's a start. Mostert, we'll see if he returns in this game. But even if he does, I don't have confidence he's going to come out there and stay healthy the whole game as Raheem Mostert, or even be a big factor with Achane pretty much getting 80% of the touches. Same thing with Jalen Wright. I think down the line he could be a fantasy option as Jalen Wright. But right now, he hasn't done much. And with the injury to Tua, this offense has really taken a step back. And pretty much Tyreek Hill and Devon Achane, the only two players I would start in the second and final game on Monday night of the week. Seattle Seahawks at the Detroit Lions. Kenneth Walker, if he plays, he's a start for me. But Zach Charbonnet, he's definitely earned this playing time now, even with Kenneth Walker back in the lineup. I believe this could be a 50-50 split where I believe Charbonnet is a better receiver out of the backfield anyway than Kenneth Walker. So Kenneth Walker, game 1 of the year, he looked great for the Seattle Seahawks. And then the injury did him in. He's missed the last 2 weeks, and Zach Charbonnet really took over and played well. So if Walker plays, I'm still going to give him a starting nod in a potential shootout at the Lions. And if Charbonnet starts again and Walker's out, he's a start. But it's going to be interesting to see if they're both healthy and what happens in this backfield, because I believe they're both talented running backs. And I believe if they did a 50-50 split like the Lions do, both these running backs could be fantasy options and be successful for the season. And out to the Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, they must start season every week. They put up top 15 numbers, both these running backs this season. Jahmyr Gibbs, the more explosive running back. Montgomery, more the running back in between the tackles and at the goal line. And this 1-2 combo, I believe, is the best combo in pro football. So this week, even in the middle of the pack matchup, I like them both in a potential shootout in a home game on Monday night. That's running back start sits every matchup for week 4 of the fantasy football season.